The palace of Zara sits like a living jewel beneath three blood-red suns, its tall crystalline towers clawing toward a sky that never forgets to glare. Inside those polished halls lay Princess Gracie, once radiant, now diminished, her iridescent scales a patchwork of purple and gold, wings folded like silk gone still. The Drakari ruled the Andromeda sector for 10,000 years. They were old, proud, and certain of their place. Yet certainty offered no succor as their princess faded on her cushions. King Vexthar paced the marble, claws scraping, voice like distant thunder. Another has failed. 17 doctors from 17 different worlds had come and gone. Sages, specialists, living libraries, and still Gracie's condition defied their instruments. Jake stood small in a corner with a cleaning rag in his hand. Human, fragile by galactic standards, newly discovered 50 years earlier and relegated to servitude. Humans were useful, not rulers, not nobles, just hands and eyes and obedient memory. Dr. Keelix, a creature of contained energy within crystal, whispered reports about failing neural pathways and a forecast of doom measured in solar cycles. The Queen produced a broken sound that shook the room. Jake had been assigned to Princess Gracie's chamber 6 months earlier. Each dawn he arrived to tidy, organize, and be as invisible as his position required. He watched, helpless, as week by week the princess grew colder. When the king ordered the court to depart, leaving only grieving formalities, Princess Gracie's amber eyes pinned Jake and for the first time asked him to remain. She heard him the way the old heard the new, her voice a wind through caverns, and asked him to stay. The hum of court doors and trailing robes faded until the great chamber belonged to two unlikely companions, a dying Drakari of lineage and a small, quiet human with a mop. Gracie's attempt at a smile exposed crystalline teeth, and she asked Jake about Earth. It was almost a child's request. Tell me of rain, of bread baking, of small human joys. Jake obliged, describing ordinary human life, autumn leaves, playground laughter, the smell of a wet street, and watched wonder glitter in the princess's dying eyes. Where scholars brought machines and measurements, Jake brought stories, and in those simple human things the princess found something unfamiliar and alive. Their talks grew gentle ritual. Jake visited before dawn, stocking cushions, sweeping dust, and when he spoke of Earth, Gracie's brightness returned a little, nostalgia for a world she'd never known. He told her about rain's ambivalence, how humans both loved and feared it, about warm bread and street vendors, about how small moments could feel like entire worlds. The princess, who lived among empires and council, soaked up these mundane images like sunlight. Yet amid stories and hush, Jake noticed an almost imperceptible wrongness, a faint, chemical tang that should not belong in a royal chamber. His mother had been a nurse and she had taught him to listen to small things, odors, temperature changes, a shift in demeanor, because they often told the truth when instruments did not. He asked Gracie softly when this sickness began. 6 months, she said, an echo of his own arrival. That coincidence pricked at Jake's memory. Every shining machine and alien intellect had scanned and rescanned Gracie's body, but had anyone scanned her room? Had the great minds considered sabotage? He asked permission to look around, not aggressively, only as a servant might, respectful of protocol but persistent in curiosity. Gracie, fragile but alert, nodded. Jake moved close to the sleeping platform, an enormous bed rigged with temperature controls and precious metals, and crouched to peer beneath it. Where polished marble met the shadow, a small hexagonal device pulsed faint green like a sick star. He felt his breath hitch. Up close he saw the carving, Drakari script, and the device's purpose became a stomach-turning certainty. A poison emitter, calibrated for slow release. This explained why the princess's symptoms were mysterious, gradual, localized, and inconsistent with known illnesses. The scholars had been looking for biology. The culprit had been hidden among cushions and protocol. Jake felt suddenly both very small and very necessary, the least expected person to detect betrayal in a court blinded by its own brilliance. When he handed the device into Gracie's trembling claw, a silence heavier than any edict filled the room. For all their millennia of rule, for all the knowledge paraded by visiting doctors, the Drakari had overlooked the simplest variable, the environment. Jake's observation, trained by humble nursing instincts and an attentiveness born of servitude, had changed the diagnosis from intractable disease to deliberate poison. News of the sabotage spread through the palace like wildfire. Lord Caxter's name rippled through courtiers and sent shock across the sector, an assassination masked as illness. The Drakari justice engine churned. Inquiries, interrogations, and political theater. Caxter's motives, ambition, fear of a changing court, resentment of reforms, became public enough to fracture old alliances. The palace, which had once relied on hierarchy and ritual, was suddenly forced to act swiftly or risk collapse. Meanwhile, Princess Gracie's recovery was steady but fragile. With the poison source gone and targeted treatments in place, the fever eased, coughs shortened, and the bioluminescent sparks that had marked her deterioration dimmed. The doctors who had once declared her condition hopeless now had a foothold. Their scans, when reinterpreted in light of the emitter, made sense. The great minds that had failed were not incompetent. They had been missing a fundamental possibility. The episode became less about failure and more about epistemic humility. Sometimes the right solution is the one you haven't considered because it seems too small. King Vexthor, a figure of enormous presence and complicated pride, took action. Publicly, he condemned sabotage and called for justice. Privately, he listened to his daughter and to the human who had saved her life. Jake was pulled before the court, not as accused but as witness and then as honored guest. The royal medallion the princess placed in his palm was more than jewelry. It symbolized a shift in social order. Humans will no longer be restricted to servant roles, she declared. Protocols would be updated, privileges reconsidered, and eyes opened. The change was practical as well as symbolic. Security protocols were rewritten to include environmental sweeps, servants were given formal channels to report anomalies, and medical teams added observational audits to their diagnostics. The palace had learned to fuse advanced knowledge with humble, ground-level attention. Mollified courtiers who feared disruption grumbled, reformers cheered. Caxthor, stripped of influence, faced trial, but the lasting victory was cultural. The Dracari admitted that their thousand-year confidence had blind spots. Jake returned to his duties changed. He still cleaned, still rose before dawn, but now under a different sky, one where his observations mattered. He was not suddenly a diplomat or a commander. He was a reminder that a system's strength depends on every unit within it, including the quiet ones. And Princess Gracie, whose recovery was now public, stood taller. She had been humbled by the experience, and that humility shaped her future decisions. The palace that had been a bastion of old power now carried the seed of something new, a willingness to listen to unlikely voices and to reconsider what counts as expertise. 3 weeks after the device's removal, Princess Gracie stood on her balcony with wings unfurled, sunlight washing her scales. Recovery had been slow but resolute. Where there had once been coughs and fever now sat a cautious vigor. Down in the lower levels, Jake prepared to resume his routine, a medallion heavy in his palm, a royal seal and a promise. The palace had changed and so had the place of humans in its society. Gracie summoned Jake back not to reward him with riches but to make a point. 17 of the galaxy's greatest minds failed, she said, voice steady, and a human with a cleaning rag looked under my bed. She laughed softly at the absurdity, and then her face grew serious. You noticed because you were present. You listened. You didn't assume that complexity required a complex answer. Her words weren't an insult to the learned, they were a manifesto about attention. The reforms were both immediate and long-term. King Vexthor's new protocols institutionalized the role of observers. Servants had channels to report anomalies without fear, environmental scans were routine, and cross-disciplinary teams were required before experts declared defeat. The palace would still prize knowledge, ritual, and counsel, but it would no longer allow them to degenerate into arrogance. Humans began to receive training and responsibilities beyond menial tasks. They learned to navigate new roles, and some found their curiosity rewarded with positions as envoys, scouts, and junior investigators. For Jake, the medallion was a door, yes, but also a reminder. He didn't want power, he wanted a chance to matter. He walked through palace corridors and into the lower levels with a lightness he hadn't known. Around him, other humans looked up in ways they hadn't before. Their futures, once restricted, opened. But progress was slow. Old attitudes lingered. Some nobles resented the change and plotted quietly. Some humans feared the responsibility thrust upon them. The story didn't end with a tidy revolution. It began a complicated realignment. Princess Gracie used her recovery to act. She pushed for ongoing audits of noble estates, for better training for palace staff, and for cultural exchanges that might weave human sensibilities, practical curiosity, unexpected observation, into Dracari institutions. King Vexthor backed her, not blindly, but with the blunt force of a ruler who'd seen the cost of ignoring simple truths. As night fell over Zara and the three suns dipped below distant horizons, Jake walked home among the denizens of the lower levels and smiled. He had started as a symbol of smallness and invisibility. Now he carried proof that attention could change history. In the vastness of space, where civilizations jousted with ideas and technologies, sometimes salvation came from noticing what everyone else had missed. The universe, it seemed, had room for both ancient wisdom and a human's rag.